You know, people always say that money can buy you a seat at the table, but it can't buy you the wisdom to know who else is sitting there. And I've seen some pretty spectacular falls from grace in my time, but nothing I mean nothing quite, compares to the day Richard Sterling decided to play the big man in a grease-stained booth at Maggie's kitchen. Now, to understand this, you've got to understand the neighborhood, because this isn't the High Reese. It's a glass and steel part of the city where Richard spent his days barking at paralegals. This is the kind of place where people still know their neighbors' middle names and the mailman stops for lemonade in July. Maggie's kitchen was the heart of it all. A diner that smelled like maple syrup and honest work, where the vinyl on the seats was cracked, but the coffee was always hot. And right in the corner, at the same table, she'd occupied every Tuesday for 20 years. Saturday, Mrs. Clara Montgomery. Clara was 74, a retired history teacher with eyes that could see right through your nonsense. But she carried herself with a kind of quiet elegance that made the diner feel like a cathedral whenever she walked in. She was the kind of woman who'd spent her life sewing quilts for the homeless and tutoring kids who everyone else had given up on, including half the city's current police force and a fair share of the city council. But she'd never tell you that herself. That morning, Clara was just having her usual poached eggs and a side of rye toast when the door swung open like someone had kicked it, and in walked Richard Sterling. He looked like he'd stepped off the cover of a magazine for people who have more offshore accounts than friends, wearing a suit that probably cost more than the diner's entire inventory, and a scowl that suggested the very air in the room was beneath him. He was on his phone, snapping at someone about a merger, pacing around the cramped aisle like a caged tiger until he finally threw himself into the booth right next to Clara, slamming his leather briefcase down so hard the silverware rattled. Thing about arrogance is that it makes you blind to the small stuff. Richard was so busy being the most important person in his own head that he didn't notice Clara reaching for her glass of water. It was a tiny thing, just a slip of the hand, a soft clink as her elbow brushed the edge of his briefcase, which was hanging halfway off the table. And suddenly, his oversized latte, the one he'd brought in from a fancy cafe down the street, because Maggie's coffee wasn't premium enough, toppled over. It wasn't a flood, just a brown stain spreading across the corner of his Italian leather. But you would have thought Clara had set his house on fire.
Ow!
Richard leapt up, his face turning a shade of purple I didn't know was biologically possible. And he didn't just yell, he erupted, calling this sweet elderly woman every name in the book, his voice dripping with a kind of venom that made the whole diner go silent. He called her a clumsy old ghost, told her she was a waste of oxygen, and then, in a moment that felt like the world stopped spinning, he reached out and backhanded her across the face. The sound of that slap ... was like a gunshot in a library. Clara's head snapped back, her glasses skidded across the floor, and for a second, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator in the back. Richard didn't even look sorry. He just stood there adjusting his tie, telling her she was lucky. He didn't sue her for the damage to his bag, completely oblivious to the fact that 20 people were recording him on their phones. But Clara, bless her soul, she didn't cry. She touched her cheek, looked up at him with a calm that was honestly terrifying, and said, "You've spent so much time looking down on people that you've forgotten how to look them in the eye. And that's going to be your undoing." Richard just laughed, a sharp, ugly sound, and walked out, thinking he'd just put some nobody in her place, not realizing he'd just ignited a fuse that was connected to a mountain of dynamite. See, Clara Montgomery had a son named Elias, and while Clara told the neighbors Elias was in logistics, that was a bit like saying a hurricane is some wind. Elias Montgomery was the shadow that moved the city's gears. A man who dealt in the kind of business that didn't happen in boardrooms but in quiet back rooms with heavy doors. He was a man who commanded a terrifying level of loyalty because he took care of his own, and Clara was his world. When the call came through, not from Clara, because she was too proud to complain, but from Maggie, the diner owner who was shaking as she spoke, Elias was in the middle of a high-stakes negotiation. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flip a table. Just stood up, thanked his associates, and walked out. If you knew Elias, that quietness was the most dangerous thing about him. Within an hour, Elias was at the diner, holding his mother's hand looking at the bruise forming on her delicate skin. He didn't ask for revenge. He just asked for the name. Richard Sterling, Maggie told him. Handing over the business card Richard had arrogantly dropped on the floor as if to say, "Call my lawyers if you want to complain." Elias looked at that card, tucked it into his pocket, and kissed his mother on the forehead, promising her that justice would be served, but the proper way. Now Richard Sterling thought he was a king because he knew the law, but Elias knew something much more powerful. He knew the people who made the law work. Richard had spent his career stepping on the little people, the secretaries, the janitors, the cougars of the courtroom, but Elias had spent his career helping those same people. The takedown didn't happen with a bat in a dark alley, because that would have been too quick, too easy. Instead, it was a surgical dismantling of a man's entire existence. It started with a phone call to the district attorney, a woman who had grown up in the same tenement building as Elias and whose law school tuition had been anonymously paid for by a community fund that Elias managed. Then, a call to the head of the State Bar Association, a man whose brother Elias had saved from a predatory gambling debt years ago. By the next morning, the video of the slap wasn't just on social media. It was the lead story on every news channel, but with a twist. It wasn't just about the assault. It was an investigative deep dive into Richard Sterling's history of excellence. Turns out, when you start digging with the right shovel, you find all sorts of bodies. Within 48 hours, 3 former paralegals came forward with signed affidavits about sexual harassment that Richard had previously paid to hush up. A massive embezzlement scheme at his firm, where he'd been skimming off the top of client escrow accounts, suddenly came to light because the firms at Guy whose mother Clara had once tutored for free decided it was finally time to hand over those lost encrypted files to the authorities. Richard arrived at his corner office on Thursday morning to find FBI agents carrying out his computers and his partners waiting with a termination agreement that didn't include a single cent of a payout. He was a pariah before lunch. He tried to call his connections, the judges he golfed with, and the politicians he donated to. But every single one of them had suddenly developed amnesia. They'd all heard the whispers. "That's Elias Montgomery's mother you're talking about. In this city, you could survive a scandal, but you couldn't survive being the man who touched the woman who was a mother to thee." Neighborhood, the actual trial was almost a formality. Richard sat at the defense table, his expensive suit now looking wrinkled and pathetic. His arrogance replaced by a hollow-eyed stare of someone who finally understands that the world doesn't belong to them. Clara took the stand, and she didn't point fingers or scream. She just spoke about the importance of respect, and how a person's character is measured by how they treat those who can do nothing for them. The judge, who had known Clara since he was a boy delivering newspapers on her block, didn't show any bias in his rulings, but his sentencing was a masterpiece of poetic justice. Richard wasn't just given jail time for the assault. The evidence of his financial crimes and the civil rights violations uncovered during the investigation led to a 15-year sentence. But the kicker? The judge ordered that Richard's personal assets, his penthouse, his cars, his offshore accounts be liquidated to pay restitution not just to Clara, but to every single victim of his previous harassment cases. The final scene of this drama wasn't in the courtroom, though. It was a few weeks later. Clara was back at Maggie's kitchen, sitting in her usual booth, looking as peaceful as a summer morning. Elias was sitting across from her, sipping a coffee that he'd paid for with a 20 and told Maggie to keep the change. The diner was bustling. The air was full of laughter. And for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like it could breathe again. Richard Sterling was in a cell, learning that in a place where you have no money and no title, all you have is your name. And his was worth less than the dirt on the floor. But here's the thing that still has people talking in the neighborhood. And I want to hear what you think about this.
How some people say Elias went too far?
That he used his shadow power to manipulate the system and destroy a man more thoroughly than the law ever could have on its own. They say that by using his influence to ensure the DA and the judge were on the right side, he was just as corrupt as the man he took down. But then you have the folks who lived on Clara's block, the people who saw Richard's boot on their necks for years. And they say that sometimes the system is so broken that it takes a man like Elias to bend it back into the shape of justice. They argue that Richard didn't just get what he deserved. He got a mirror held up to his face, and he just couldn't survive what he saw. I'm curious, was this a victory for the good guys? Or was it just one kind of power replacing another? Did Richard Sterling deserve to lose his entire life over one slap? Or do we live in a world where an eye for an eye is the only language people like him actually understand? Drop a comment and tell me if you think Elias was a hero or just a different kind of villain. Because honestly, in a city like this, the line between the two is thinner than a coat of paint. And if you've ever seen someone get their comeuppance in a way that felt like fate finally stepped in, I want to hear that story. To hit that subscribe button and stay tuned. Because there are a lot more shadows in this city, and they all have stories to tell.